Thank you for joining us here for our Core Humanities Thoughts on Tap, our monthly series. Today, we're going to be looking at building legacies of social justice and activism. And thank you all so much for coming, for being here tonight, pushing through your, I'm sure, very intense Zoom fatigue at this point, to join us for our panel tonight. So building legacies of social justice and activism. So the panel is part of the Thought on Tap public engagement series brought to you by Core Humanities here at UNR and the College of Liberal Arts and Laughing Planet. I'm Meredith Oda. I'm a professor in the history department. So this year in the Thoughts on Tap series, we've been exploring legacies. In the fall, we looked at confronting corrosive and harmful legacies. And now in the spring, we're turning to more optimistic ground. And we've been looking forward with building legacies in health and healing, and equity and education, and then next month in economic empowerment. Today, we'll be exploring people working to build legacies of social justice and activism. So this past year, I think we can all agree, has been both disheartening and also supremely inspiring in a lot of ways, as we've been faced with both chilling incidents and kind of vast structures of injustice, such as the horrific murder of George Floyd, whose deaths we're now terrifyingly reliving in the current trial of his killer, to the ravaging of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities by COVID. But what we've also seen, I think, is new and longstanding activists and organizations rising to confront and dismantle these injustices in local communities across the nation and around the world. So this evening, we're going to talk to some of those activists, people who both study and work in social justice movements. So please join us for our conversation with these activists who are working on behalf of detained migrants, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and for other causes as they describe their work and the work of other activists here in Reno, around the United States, and again, all over the world. So our first panelist I'll introduce you to this evening is Escenthio Marigny. So Escenthio has been an organizer for over 10 years. He's previously organized around environmental justice, education, and state police violence. As an undergraduate here, Theo helped to found the Reno Justice Coalition student organization. And currently, he's a master's student in the Department of Gender, Race, and Identity at UNR, where his research focuses on comparing how Black movements in Colombia and the United States respond to and were impacted by the war on drugs. We also have Dr. Satsuki Ina, who is a writer, activist, it's a very long list, a writer, activist, therapist specializing in community trauma, and professor emeritus at CSU Sacramento. She was born in the Tule Lake Japanese American Segregation Center and has produced two seminal films. If you haven't seen them, I would encourage you to, about the Japanese American World War II incarceration, Children of the Camps, and From a Silk Cocoon. She is also one of the co-founders of Tsuru for Solidarity, a group that we're going to hear more about shortly, so I'll let her tell you more about that. And also, just FYI, you can find a recent piece that she wrote published in Time magazine last month, calling for the end to migrant child and family detention. Next, we have Dr. Prisca Gayles, a sociologist in the departments of Sociology, Gender, Race, and Identity here at UNR, who specializes in race and ethnicity, social movements, migration and citizenship, transnational Black feminisms, and the African diaspora in Argentina. She received her PhD in Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and has held fellowships from Williams College, the Fulbright Foundation, and the Tinker Foundation. Currently, she's working on an ethnography of how emotions permeate the macro and micro politics of Argentina's Black social movement. And then behind the camera that we'll see later is Dr. Daniel Enrique Perez, Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the College of Liberal Arts and a professor of Chicanx and Latinx Studies in the World Languages and Literatures Department, who researches and teaches on Chicanx and Latinx cultural productions, queer theory, masculinities, and transnational and migration studies. And he's going to be moderating the chat for us this evening and also passing on any questions you might have for us on the panel. All right, so this evening I'm going to open up with a few questions, but I do encourage everyone in the audience to raise any questions that you have. You can just drop them into the chat or unmute yourself later too. Our panelists represent a range of experience and expertise, so please do join in and help us direct this conversation. So I'm going to begin, and this is to everybody. I'd like to open up broadly with just asking you for kind of a brief description of what social justice activism means to you and how you came to it. Tell us about the causes that you advocate for and how you came to be involved in social justice movements. What drew you to them and what kind of activated you in the past? So maybe we could start with Escenthio and then we can turn to our other panelists.
Oh my. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. So I think for me, I'm originally from Oakland, California. So my activism and organizing started from, I think, you know, being in proximity to a lot of movement things that were happening in the Bay. But I think what really sparked it was I was in high school around the time, you know, that there was this second push to go into the Iraq War. So there was a lot of anti-war movement things going on. There was also a lot of fights for immigrants' rights going on, and you know, just also being around people fighting around issues of education in schools. And so I think what really pushed me was, you know, being introduced to these ideas from movements and mentors and organizations I just happened to come across. And also my own experience, right? So I finally found something in these movements and mentors and organizations that put into context the things I was seeing in my own life in terms of, you know, talking about the war on drugs and how that started, the policies that initiated that, you know, my family's experience with being in relation to the welfare system and how dehumanizing it is. All these different things kind of really being in proximity to those movements allowed me to radicalize me and radicalize my own personal experience. So I'll stop there because I can go on for like, and then in
I forgot there was so much Bay Area connection here this evening. I think we all have one. Let's see, so Satsuki, could I ask you to go next?
So I'm here from Oakland, California, Escenthio. My legacy actually in social justice action comes from the fact that my parents were removed from their homes shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1942. They were placed in American concentration camps, and I was born in one of those camps. And so I'm known as someone who was born during time. And so much of the story of my parents' incarceration experience and my community's experience was one so traumatized, but also so distorted through government narrative that the true story of what happened to my family was something that I have spent my lifetime trying to uncover. And I think it led to my decision to be a psychologist and eventually to focus on community trauma. I think so many events have led to this. The older you get, the more events push you along the path. So I'll just cut to the chase on it. It was in 2015 that a young Japanese American whose family grandparents were actually held at the Tule Lake Segregation Center where I was born, was working as an ACLU attorney and called me to say that this was 2015, the end of the Obama administration, that children and families were being imprisoned in South Texas. And there was very little access to what was going on in there. And he asked if I would go undercover for ACLU as a religious visitor so that I could go in and evaluate the trauma that the children were experiencing. So I don't even speak Spanish, but I had a priest who sat next to me, and we turned our backs, and we managed to, I managed to interview several mothers and children, and found the experience so disturbing. Children actively traumatized, and mothers who were still breastfeeding their babies that had crossed the border to save their babies' lives, essentially. And so then shortly after that, I went back several times, and one of them was to protest another one of the South Texas family detention facilities. And when I was there, I realized that just 40 miles west of where I was standing in front of this Dilley Family Residential Center, euphemistically called, was where I had been incarcerated with my mother and brother, separated from my father under indefinite detention for not ever having committed a crime, but having the face of what they considered the enemy, and realized how parallel and how resonant the current treatment of people seeking asylum in this country were being treated. And so since that time, have been actively involved in an organization that we started by people like myself in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who had been children in the prison camps during World War II. And it's called Tsuru for Solidarity. I'll turn it over to you, Prisca.
Thank you. Wow. I'm really honored to be in your presence. That's an amazing history. I think so much of my activism has also stemmed from like my personal experiences in my history. And so I think you asked what social justice means to us, how we came to social justice or our activism, and then our current work. So to answer that first question, I think that for me, what social justice means is recognizing that inequality doesn't just exist for no reason at all, that it has to do with historical factors that were in many ways intentional. And to undo those injustices and those forms of inequality, we have to reckon with those historical factors and actively work towards systemic change. And so in terms of my, I would say the first time I became involved in social justice, it was also in high school. I'm also from Oakland, California.
Right.
I didn't realize we were all going to be from Oakland, California. But growing up, I suffered like very badly from asthma. And I remember at one point I couldn't play on the basketball team. I couldn't do a lot of things because my asthma was so bad. And I remember going to I was in the hospital one time that I had to be hospitalized. And the doctor was asking me about my siblings and if they had asthma. And I was that very inquisitive child. And I said, oh, is it hereditary? And the doctor said, no, just African-Americans suffer at higher rates from asthma. And I thought, well, there has to be a reason why. And so part of that, the work that I started in high school was really working to educate folks in West Oakland on kind of how to recognize triggers, how to train, like you can play sports. So swimming is one of the things. And so part of the work that I started in high school was just working with middle school and elementary school children in West Oakland on how to recognize and stay away from triggers. And so part of that was doing some environmental justice work, although I didn't realize it at the time. And that's kind of what I did up through high school. Also in high school, I fell in love with magical realism. And so I was going to, and then discovered that it was so much more beautiful to read Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Spanish than in English. And I majored in Spanish. And then I went to Cuba to study. So Jose Marti is known as this, big philosopher, but also was a poet. And so I went to Cuba with a rare opportunity to study in Cuba, to study the poetry of Jose Marti. And I believe that was kind of the door to my activism in terms of transnational racial justice. So while in Cuba as a study abroad student, I was the only African-American student from the University of Pittsburgh. That's where I was going at the time. And every day, and when I say every day, I'm not exaggerating, it was every single day, like while walking to the University of Havana with my peers, the police would stop me and say, Señora, muéstrame el carnet, which means show me your ID. And that one time I just like broke down in tears and I got really exasperated. And I said, why does this happen to me every day? And he said, one of the officers said, with all due respect, you look Cuban, and Cubans often try to like mooch off tourists, like paraphrasing. And for me, that was so paradoxical because Cuba is a very multiracial nation. And I thought, it's not just that I look Cuban, it's that I look Afro-Cuban. And so I started to ask questions, and not for nothing, like many of the folks that I spoke with in Cuba said, no, racism still here exists. We're not allowed to say that. And so that was my entrance to different racial schemas, right? And so then on another study abroad trip, I was actually studying the roots of the tango. Is where I started in Argentina. I met activists working in the movement there. And that is a movement that is so invisible in studies and conversations of racial justice. And so one of my questions were, what does it take to be heard and to be visible and to be successful in a place where folks say you don't even exist? And so that's the current work I do. I'm part of the gender section of a Black social movement, the Black, like explicitly Black feminist section of that social movement in Argentina. And I'll leave it there for questions, but it's kind of a little trajectory of my activism.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think there's so many cross sections here, just sort of geographically, but also I think obviously thematically too. So could you all talk a little bit about kind of some of the, actually, I'm kind of interested. I want to just go off something that you said just now, Prisca, that draws off what Satsuki just mentioned in terms of, you know, your background really pulled you to your career as a psychotherapist and dealing with community or sort of long-term trauma. I'm wondering too what you brought as an activist yourself, Prisca, to your academic work. How did that and actually this is to you too, Escenthio. How did your work as activists in your I don't know, you know, IRL, in your real life outside of academia, inform how you then understood your academic work? And this would actually be for you as well, Satsuki, please.
Did you want me to start or?
Or yeah, if you don't, sure, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. And so I think for me, I really don't see my activism as happening apart from my scholarship. And so it's interesting because once I was at the University of Texas and you know, as part of the activist research program, you read this Austin School Manifesto. And so I think for me, what scholarship or what intellectualism is questions about how the world works. And so for me, my questions about how the world works are not both up in terms of physical science, natural sciences, social sciences. They're not separate in terms of what we can do to make the world better. And so I think for me, like my activism, whether it was what can I do to make African-American children in Oakland experiences of asthma, like help them live a fuller life, are tied to my questions of how can we better understand how racialized systems reproduce themselves in different ways, but still, no matter whether it's the United States, the system of racism in the United States, and different countries throughout Latin America and South America and Europe, that still lead to really disenfranchised social indicators for non-white people. And so I think that really, I don't see my activism and my scholarship as separate even. I don't see them as like two things coming together. It's like one thing. So I hope that answers your question.
Theo, do you wanna, or Escenthio, do you wanna, or?
I'll wait after.
Okay. I think it's so wonderful, Prisca, that you were so aware because I think for me, I would never have thought about my educational experience as having much to do with activism. Although when I reflect back now, I see that I wasn't necessarily surrounded by activists, but I was reacting to the education that I was given. So my doctoral dissertation was on the need to develop cultural competence in therapists who were providing particularly marriage and family counseling, because so much of my psychology training was Euro-based and values, you know, family structure, family history, types of interventions. And so I think that if I had, you know, connections with other people who were activists, who were using the language and the framework for activism, I would have been able to define myself more clearly. But I felt like I was kind of on a road by myself. And so much so that I won't tell you what school I went to, but during my doctoral dissertation, I had a committee member question the fact that there was actually racism in the world. And then I had to spend several months getting him off my dissertation committee. So of course that was many years ago, but but I think how it impacted my career eventually was I realized that my interest, I established a clinic to provide services. This was in Sacramento for low-income clients. And I realized that the clients that were coming in one by one, the themes were so repetitive. The consequences of oppression, the internalized racism, all of these kinds of things. And so gradually I moved out of doing one-on-one individual therapy to look more at the larger system, and then got engaged in being involved with communities that were dealing with trauma related to racism, and worked more as a consultant, organizing systems and creating environments where people could talk about the issues that were confronting them, that topics and discussions that they weren't having before, to make changes in their own personal way of surviving racism in their organization or in their church or in their agency, but also how to change the culture of the system. Yeah, I'll stop there. Go ahead, Theo.
Dun, dun, dun. And just to be, and the question again is, how did my personal experience influence scholarship?
Oh yeah, how your
Okay.
experience as an activist helps to inform your scholarship, your research questions, how you approach it.
Right. Yeah, I think it's like this constant back and forth, right? Like, you know, in high school, first starting to push back against anti-war movement, not because it's like some idealized, like, oh, that's far away. It's because I figured the more, they were at my school, they were recruiting students of color, right? They used to call it, some of the conscientious objectors I used to organize with, who were mentors of mine, we call it a poverty draft. And I'm thinking to myself, this is one of those aha moments. Y'all want us to go fight somebody else on the other side of the world, and we ain't got no damn decent library. Pardon my language. We don't have a decent library. You don't have, what I mean? Like, police are hemming people up. People are dying of, all these different things in our neighborhood. That just didn't make sense. So to me, my scholarship was like, how do I make this make sense? There's so many contradictions. Like, why aren't people fighting back? Are they fighting back, or maybe I'm not seeing it? Like, how are we able to, patriotism and fervor for war happening? This is what I'm thinking in high school. But our conditions are so terrible and traumatic in some ways, right? So in terms of my scholarship and the questions I started looking at, I started going to places that would try to make that make sense to me, and that ended up, I was early on involved with, like, nonprofit organizations. I ended up going a little bit more left, we'll say that, and getting involved and reading some, a gentleman named Karl Marx came into the fray. And then, Harry Haywood and all these other figures, Claudia Jones, and, these kind of radical, some of them comments, and all these thinkers, it started to make sense to me, because it's like, well, this system is so bad, then I'm trying to make sense of, like, something has to go, right? In my high school mind, I still hold fast to some of these beliefs, but I think in a different way. So yeah, I think trying to make sense of the contradictions that I saw while engaging in, in organizing, talking to fellow high school students about the war, why does it make people are like, why should I even care about what's happening with that, right? And that's a question I have to sit down and think about, right? Or talking about issues around education, and so I had to start thinking about tying it to, well, we're spending all that money over there, but look at the education system we have here. Look at our neighborhood. So it really forced me to kind of dig in the books to respond to the concrete things that were happening in my community and then in my own life. And so now, you know, when I'm thinking about even my thesis now, you know, or when I'm trying to move towards, you know, is like I don't think you could deal with the issues just locally, right? What I've come to find out is these systems are global. I mean, they take on different dimensions, right? So I think, you know, I'm just going on now, y'all. I'm gonna say this and then I'm gonna move on. So I think my scholarship has been influenced very much by my interactions on the ground with other people, organizing around issues, and then trying to just make sense of my own experiences as well, and even pushing beyond, you know, the things that I do know.
I want to just comment on, Escenthio, what you're saying is that the fact that your activism started in high school is like remarkable to me. Because at the time that I was in high school, there was nothing called ethnic studies. And I think about my high school years, you know, where the most important thing, we had these white buckskin shoes. And the most important thing was whether you had enough powder in your little bag to whiten your shoes with. And those were that was kind of the level of what we talked about in our circle. And what I'm finding now is talking to next generation of young people who have a way leg up on examining things the way you have begun in your high school experience. So that's one light of hopefulness.
And actually that's because a lot of you, both Escenthio and Prisca, you had both talked about coming into activism pretty early. And that was kind of notable. So could you talk a little bit about kind of the, and so, you know, we have a kind of spread of generation here, activism. So could you talk a little bit too about kind of where sort of mentors came from in activism? Did you seek out, did you find, did you know, encounter mentors in your community, in organizations that kind of helped you move forward? What kind of support systems, I guess, did you find from among previous activists, other, you know, longstanding organizations? And we can flip this too for Satsuki as well, like how you have, I know you've done a lot of work kind of with youth organizing too, and providing that kind of mentorship and scaffolding for new generations.
I guess I can start because I was trying to think of like who were my mentors when I was like doing this work with, like I was volunteering with the American Lung Association. I was on the California Advisory Board, and I was thinking like who was my mentor, and really it was my mother, who was just very supportive of like. I mean, my mother she was a single mom, and there was quite a few of us, but like she got me to San Francisco to meet with that California Advisory Board. She got me like down into the deep West Oakland to volunteer at the Y and teach like asthma training sessions. She sought out like more opportunities for me. And so I think at least up until up through college, my mom has been one of my major mentors in terms of like supporting what I want to do, or like my interest in activism. And it's so ironic because at the same time, my mom is the one who, like when I was 7, she was like, oh, you used to say at 7 that you were going to be a cardiovascular surgeon. So there's no 7-year-old who says that. So I knew you were going to be. So like while I was like 23, like majoring in Latin American studies, my mom was telling people like, oh, she's in med school. And I'm like, I'm not. So it's ironic because she simultaneously like had this dream for me to be a cardiovascular surgeon, but simultaneously like literally like broke her back to make sure that I could study the career that I wanted to, volunteer when I wanted to, study abroad when I wanted to. So I think in terms of like, because mentorship is sometimes like information, but my mom didn't go to college. So like hers was support and then access to like opportunities in the way she's a powerful networker. And so I think that most certainly in terms of like, when I think about mentorship as like this kind of holistic, like providing information, helping to see new ideas, but also like that emotional and psychological support, my mom was my mentor. And then as I got into, for example, my research in Argentina. It's interesting. And the folks who were mentoring me were older Afro-Argentine women who had been kind of, the social movement emerged in 2013, but these are women who had founded like Black activist organizations in the 1980s, shortly after Argentina's military dictatorship ended and civil organizing was allowed, and so, or wasn't brutally repressed. And so it's interesting, and I think for me that mentorship or that guidance by older Afro-Argentine women also helped me reconcile with this questions and issues that I was having around positionality, that desire to share and to say like, yes, go write about this in English, write about it in Spanish too, but write about this is in English, because we've been involved in this activism for 40, 50 years and people don't know that it exists, right? And so in terms of that they were giving me information, oh, here's who you need to talk to if you want to find out like when the government created this commission, here's who you want to talk to if you want to find out the truth about, like, you know, and so now it's interesting, I see it, I think mothering is one of the ways I look at mentoring, and it might just be because so many Black women have participated in like, and I think of mothering as like care work, right? And so this radical form of mothering that has been really helpful to like the opportunities I've had, but also the things I've learned, and also some of the new questions that are emerging.
So it's interesting to hear what you're saying, Prisca, because you know, I'm 77 years old, and so I feel like my youth experience was still under the veil of having our whole community traumatized from the incarceration. So our way of responding to our freedom after 4.5 years of being incarcerated was to not cause any problems, not ask any questions, to just do what you're told, keep your head down, and don't cause any problems. And that was the message from my parents. So much so that even though I was at UC Berkeley during the free speech movement and the birth of the civil rights movement, surrounded by people talking about Malcolm X, and you know, there was so much vitality around the possibility of speaking out, and people were organizing. But I got phone calls every night from my parents saying, we do not want to see your face in the newspaper. You are not to protest. We have saved our money so you could go to college, so you could have a good career. You go to class. So, you know, like a good Japanese girl, I went to class, and I remember really crystal clear the day that I was walking to class and all the students were walking in the opposite direction by Sathergate. They were all going to hear the speakers and be part of the protest. And I went to class, sat down, there were maybe 3 or 4 other students there in a class that, you know, usually has 125 students. And the professor came running down the aisle, jumped on top of the desk, and turned and looked at us and said, God damn it, if you show up in class, I'm gonna flunk every single one of you. And I was frozen. You know, my pleas from my parents to not cause a problem. And it led to actually, I mean, my awareness now is so clear about what they were living under. This fear that if we caused any problems, we could immediately be imprisoned again. And so when I went home and talked to my parents, I said, well, what is all this about? And that's when they told me the family secret, which was that they had renounced their American citizenship during their incarceration, having lost all faith in the American world, and they wanted to take their children to Japan, although they were American citizens. Yeah, I think the fact that the generational difference, like I didn't become an activist pretty much until, you know, I was 70, and a quiet activist prior to that, but still under the veil of the trauma that had inhibited our expression of ourselves.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel like I don't even need to be on this panel. Y'all too I just want to listen to y'all. I feel like I was very fortunate in many ways. I really resonate with what Dr. Gayles talked about in terms of, her mother's role as a mentor. I feel like my mom and my aunt were very much, I didn't think about that at the time, but, as I've gotten older, it's like, oh, they gave me a lot of gems that kind of really, helped me just in life and in terms of organizing. And I think when we think of organizing, we think of it as like it has to be all theory, all these. Sometimes it's about building relationships and talking to people. And that's at the root of it. And I think sometimes we kind of, the lessons I learned in terms of building with people, I think I really got that from them, especially my aunt. But then I was also fortunate because, it's the Bay Area, so something's in the water. You're like one person away from somebody who was an ex-Panther or, did some sort of organizing or something. And so, having to go to high school there and being vocal, maybe not necessarily being involved, but being vocal in certain places, having mentors come to me and invite me to, or other students sometimes, right, invite me to events. I had an English teacher who I was doing terrible at a high school, and I transferred to another one, and I had to, make up credits. And what he did was like, over the summer, I want you to read Wretches of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. I want you to watch Battle of Algiers. I want you to read Souls of Black Folk, and I want you to write. I bring that up to say, like, that's pretty, you don't always get that in high school, right? And there was an intellectual mentorship in that sense, right? And I think, which is important, but I think it's also like, there were other figures as well who taught me how to organize. And, I'm kind of brash, I can be. I've been trying to dial back. So, teaching me tact and, how do you relate to people? How do you build? Like, it's not just about being right, but you have to listen, you know what I mean? And you have to be in communication and communing with people when you're building. So I feel fortunate to had several mentors who play that role in high school, even to this now as a graduate student, right?
I mean, actually, we have a couple of questions coming in here. So let's see. I'll start with Olive. Has a question, and she's asking, what is your opinion of working within the system to enact change? And what advice do you have for people who are just starting their journeys into activism? Well, that's great. So I guess you turn around and pay it forward a little bit.
I wouldn't mind starting with this one. So I mentioned before talking about how not seeing my activism as separate from my scholarship, and how at the University of Texas, we read this piece called the Austin School Manifesto, which is about activist research. And then I think one of the questions that it asks is that very question. And so I recall a really not like an argument, but a really heated discussion in my first Black Studies theory class at University of Texas at Austin. And we had read Audre Lorde's piece, on the master's tools. And so the professor, re-asked that question that Audre Lorde asked, like, what does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? And so we went into this, like, oh, the Ivy Tower can never, and then so we go on and on about, how like we're part of a system that is part of the problem. And so we talk about it for on and on and on. And then the professor just sits there, and then we kind of calm down, and then he says, well, then what are you all doing here? and we kind of didn't have an answer to that, right? And so we start, I think that is a question that I constantly think about. And then he kind of helped us. And so then we talked about how Audre Lorde then goes on to say that it's really that when you are that notion of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house means that only the very smallest parameters of change are possible. And so for me, what that means is two things. It means that it is important for people to be working in those institutions, to be trying to seek change, because you know it's going to happen very, very small, very incrementally, and very slowly. And it's ever the more important. But also what that means for me is that my commitment to social justice and social change can not only happen from within the institution. And I think that's a huge part of why I do participant activism. Like, whether or not I'm writing a paper for a journal, I'm in contact with the women I work with in Argentina. Every time I go back, before I ever try to schedule interviews, I'm like on the ground. What are we working on? Are we writing letters? Are we organizing a protest? And so for me, I think that working within the system is important, but it cannot be the only way that we work towards social change.
Well, I'm definitely agree with Prisca that, well, for me, maybe there's stages of working inside the system. For me, it was a university system, and incremental change felt very small to me. It felt like a struggle, and but it has to happen. I much rather work outside of the system now. You know, I don't have much to lose now. I don't have to worry about getting tenure or anything like that anymore. So I really am luxuriating in the freedom of working outside of the system and of critiquing the systems, but also nurturing, educating young people who have to live in the system, who have to work in the system, who with a different orientation towards, you know, what has to be taken for granted and what needs to be challenged, is the way that I have some connection to the internal system that needs constantly to be pushed. And I think for me, the promise is the young people coming up to become faculty, to become administrators, to lead with the values of, you know, a new democracy. So yeah, I like being old, frankly. It feels really freeing. And I have to say, in our Tsuru for Solidarity, most of our organization is comprised of older people like myself, who are, you know, who've spent most of our lives fitting in to not cause problems. And, you know, what happened is we lost. In my generation, we don't have a lot of artists, creatives, musicians, artists, actors, because our parents were lived so fearfully after their release that we were all channeled to become doctors and optometrists and people who could create security, really, to protect our parents and to guarantee that we would not be cast out again. And so in that way, there was this constriction and the loss of a lot of our creative energy. So us old guys now, like, you know, we don't give a damn. we are speaking out. We are doing what we need to do, what we feel like is so important, and wanting to inspire young people to do what they can inside while we work on the outside.
And I would just like to add, I was at the Association of Asian American Studies conference earlier today, and I happened to see a video of Satsuki baiting a military police officer to arrest her as she and other protesters stood on the Fort Sill site, a potential that was going to be a place where they were going to hold child migrants, unaccompanied minors. And so, yes, I can attest to the fact that I witnessed what that freedom, I guess, gives you. And then, Escenthio, did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something I struggle with. I think like I've mentioned before, I've worked in nonprofits. I've also done like radical collective work, outside of, nonprofits, kind of antagonistic to certain forces, right? Not just to be antagonistic because the particular analysis we had of limitations. I think now I'm like, I'm of the mind that it's going to be a multi-pronged attack, but also have no illusions. I think it's all right that, if you were in a position and you in an institution or, where capitalism's everywhere, ain't nobody got clean hands. It's what type of system that kind of, some people's hands are bloodier than others, but you have to, in a sense, pick your poison, I think. That sounds terrible. Let me rephrase that. I don't want to turn anybody away. Well, I think it's the truth to it, right? I think for me, I think constantly be critical and understand the systems and institutions you're working with. The biggest thing and most dangerous thing that people can do is be naive about what they're going to get from elections, what they're going to get from being in certain institutions. Because if you think you just go win the election, I think, and everything will change, you have no, I don't think, understanding of how this works. If you want to use an election or a campaign to talk about issues and kind of change the narrative and build like actual base, that's one thing, right? And it's nice to have people in certain positions inside too who agree, you know what I mean, who may be able to help build. But to me, I'm all about just I'm not going to knock anybody from working in institutions. I'm in the institution now as a graduate student. You know what I mean? I think you have to have this multi-pronged attack, but I also think there needs to be, especially in this moment now, a tendency to try to build autonomous organizations from people who are not necessarily, and it's hard to do, wed to foundation funding, wed to political parties, that can actually put pressure, I think, on these various levels of power, right? And that doesn't mean that people can't be in institutions or work within the system, or because it's multiple systems. We also think we have to be honest about what they do and the limits of it, and don't fool yourself, otherwise. And in terms of what one could do now, I think just go out and try an organization, right? Be able to set your boundaries, because some places will burn you out. Just because it's a movement space does not mean it doesn't have issues either. So don't come in, be aware of that. But go and try things out, talk to people, build networks. Just give it a shot. There's no nobody has a perfect answer, because we wouldn't be in some of the situations we in. So, yeah.
Meredith, I can chime in now also to add some of the questions that have appeared in chat or in the question and answer box. But thank you all for this conversation. You are truly, truly inspiring people. And I just want to add a question here from Carlos Matos. He's a student in CH203. And he wants to ask if you can talk about what you like best about the work that you do, and how would you educate the public about certain issues that are going on in our world, like racism and other problems? Anyone want to respond?
Yeah, I like best standing up against a military officer that's 6 feet tall and telling them we're not going to move. Actually, the thing I love best about the work is actually working with the young people. We are an organization of intergenerational folks, and so inspired by young people. We just did a panel that included a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, and 2 17-year-olds, talking about ways in which they are learning about the injustice in the world, and then the actions that they are taking. I mean, really remarkable young people. And during that time, one of the young people decided that he wanted to use that moment to raise funds for one of the panelists who's actually living in sanctuary. And thanks to his effort, we raised $6,000 for, 15-year-old Ivan, so he could buy new shoes and clothes, because he is growing so fast right now. But he just spent his 5th year in sanctuary from Guatemala with his mother. So that's the best part. That's the part that I like the most. I feel like that's how the work will get carried on, is when you make space for the young voices and share your story so they can carry on the story that gives them the background for why they should be speaking out. And that's why, Escenthio, it's so important that you're here today.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question, Carlo. Thank you very much. I think I'll start with the second question about how we educate the public about certain issues that are going on in the world, like racism and other problems now. I think conversations like this, right? It's aside from the work that we do, that's part of our career with writing and publishing, right? Having conversations not only in academic institutions, but with community members. After I got like a number of requests for radio interviews in Argentina after the murder of George Floyd. And so like that was one way of sharing about not only racial injustice in the US, but also to take that platform of a nationally syndicated radio station in Argentina to say, and there's also racism that occurs and police brutality that occurs in Argentina in these ways and forms. So I think really just taking the time to recognize how important dialogue is, outside of like the job description. And so that's kind of one of the ways that I hope that I'm educating others about the work. And then I think the question about what I like best about my work is a really hard question, because it's really hard to study. It's hard to study racism. It is. The interviews are gut-wrenching. The witnessing of it is painful. But I do think, and I think it's not for nothing that I study emotions and social movements. And I think of an interview that Alicia Garza did talking about Black Lives Matter and talking about how spaces of activism really just create this, how the very act of countering injustice creates innovation and imagination and Black joy. And that is something that isn't kind of one of the immediate successes of the movement. And it's something that I saw, I have this one chapter where I talk about after a conversation with Chaparral Wells, who's one of the Chicago mothers, a group of Black women who have lost their children to police violence, talking about pain to purpose and how the activism really gave her reason to continue living and to find joy again in life. And I recognized that like, this is what the women that I've been interviewing in Argentina are saying as well, when they felt like at this place of like an impasse where they couldn't make sense of what was happening to them every day, just walking down the street, and how their activism, the joy that comes from that community. And I think in social movements theory, it's referred to as emotional in-process benefits. And so I think one of the things that I enjoy most about the work that I do is that, not the work that I do, the work that activists do, is that by bringing other people in the movement, they're helping them see that, another way is possible. And that is so crucial in movements where, like, for example, most of the people that I know who are involved in racial justice movement don't necessarily believe that there's going to be real systemic change in their lifetime, right? And so that finding that creativity and imagination and community is so important, and also feels good, so.
Yeah, so I haven't, I've been organizing for some time, but in the last couple of years, for health and other reasons, I stepped back and been doing more background things. And so part of coming back to grad school has been opportunity trying to reflect on the work that I have done, or reflect on what's going on. I think there's to Dr. Gayles' point, something important about dialogue. I also think there's something important about reflection, and having time to think and process what's going on, and movement spaces. Sometimes it's it's always a crisis, which is the nature of, this world right now under these systems. And I think we also have to make room to process and think. So I think I'm just now really being able to appreciate some of the work that I've done over the years, and consider, the lessons learned and the mistakes, and grow from that. So when I hit it again, because I think you have to think about this, to me, it's a lifelong thing. And sometimes you can't just always be out in the front line. So I have to step back and come back in. So when I come back full organizer mode, well, I had some time to reflect. It's going to be some drama out here. No, let me not. But so I think what I like in processing and thinking about what I like about my work is exactly what has been mentioned before, is showing that another world is possible, building community. I'm getting a little older. I'm not the youngest person in groups anymore. So it's like, I have an opportunity to mentor other people and see them take things and do things that I could never even think of, and hopefully slam dunk this in a way that I can't, you know what I mean, that I may not be able to see. So that's something I appreciate. And then the community you built too is so critical, I think, and the love, when things go well, because, things can get, shaky. But also, I think the last point is, I think I'll leave it there, actually. So, yeah.
Well, thank you all. And Prisca started commenting on actually a question that I wanted to pose. And I think we've answered everything else in the chat already, but can you all talk just briefly about the future of your work and also of social justice activism? And just thinking about how many of you talked about how you came into your work, also some of the histories that impacted you, and also even tactics that were used in the past. But how do you see these things changing in the future, especially considering social media, how we're actually having this forum today, right, because of the COVID pandemic and just other issues? But how do you see social justice activism and some of the movements that you're involved with transforming in the future? What does the future look like for them?
It's an interesting question because, when you're actively organizing and responding, it's moment to moment. I mean, every time I open up my computer, there's something that has to be done. And in the immediate future, I look forward to, I think the power of direct action has really been remarkable. And it's just having gathered in my own community, the Japanese American community, been kind of locked down. And so, my hope in the immediate future is that we will be back on the streets again. We will be showing up in DC. We will be hanging folded Japanese paper cranes by the thousands on the fence there to demand that these detention facilities be closed down. In the long-term future, I feel like the whole idea of social justice activism is catching on in a way that we're just not a few troublemakers, that it is becoming more and more a familiar way that we push for change. We know in our organization and with our allies have found that grassroots activism has a profound effect. We have made changes. We have gotten responses. We have protected children because we showed up and we got the press and we got social media. So I think we have more tools now to cross, boundaries and get national movements going in ways that we couldn't in the past. So I feel like this is the path. This is a way that future change can move so much faster to push legislation and policy to change the basic way in which we function in this country.
I'm kind of heartened by, during the last year, we saw this increase in mutual aid and support within communities, right? Which I think is at once a beautiful thing, but it's also showing how much the state is not, the state does not protect people the way it should. So, that whole social contract thing, we might have to go back and examine that. It's protected some people. But I think to the point that was made previously, I think the future is going to be in experimentation, building in our communities, being able to respond and put pressure from outside, I think is what will be critical, because I think, unfortunately, what we've seen, and I'm not, I go back and forth where we see this ground, but I think it may not be one of the crucial fights. The state is not listening, and I think that's because the power from below is we need to build power and rebuild these movements, right? There are obviously things happening, but I think what I'm hoping for is a more of a coherence from these different movements and different organizations that have shown up during COVID, but even prior to that, right? And that's what I'm excited about. I think this is a turning point. Last year is a turning point. We just may not necessarily see it quite yet. These things take some time. But I do think there's going to be a lot of experimentation. I think a lot of, unfortunately, hard and terrible lessons have been learned, and we're going to see some new things, I think, come to the forefront in terms of how we think of movements and how we think of struggle that go beyond what we have considered legitimate or the means that which we do things, right?
I want to just add one thing before we have Prisca speak out, because the future is going to be based on solidarity, that we're finally breaking down barriers across communities. Our mostly Japanese American, Asian American brothers and sisters are organizing to support HR 40 because our community received redress and reparations many years ago. And so we're forming allyship with different organizations. And our last protest in Oklahoma, we had Black Lives Matter, United We Dream, we had Bend the Arc, American Indian Movement, Brown, and it was incredible. And to me, that was the future, that white supremacy has fractured us and kept us from working together. And as we move through our own internalized racism, that we see each other as the way in which we can build our strength, like Escenthio was saying, that the way we're going to get stronger is when we all work together. So even having like this panel discussion with all of us sharing our perspective is an example of what lies ahead and what will make the difference in this country.
Thank you so much for that. Actually, you said the future is solidarity, and I was going to say, I'm not going to tell you what I was going to say. I'll say the two things I was going to say, and then I'll say the second thing, which really very much so relates to what you just said. For one of the, I was going to say the future is struggle. And so, like I said, a lot of the issues that we deal with are so systemic and are so ingrained to the way that our modern society currently exists that we are going to be working for quite some time to dismantle it. The other thing that I was going to say is that the future is transnational solidarity. And so I think that, while like global structures and globalization in general has really resulted in damaged lives to such a large scale, what we might think of as the alter or counter globalization movement is also resulted in these increased connections and the sharing of information. And so, like Satsuki said, we have folks coming together from all walks of life, but not only domestically, internationally, right? The information that's being shared. We're learning strategies that we never even thought of that have been useful and effective in other places. And I think that is really important. And I think for anybody who is concerned with activism, I think it's really important to recognize that each and every one of our success for social justice depends on the success of everyone else. And so I think the future is intersectional and transnational. And I hope it is.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a fantastic note to end on. So go out and take to the streets, partner with people. And I think it's interesting to know that all of you too your work has taken you across borders. And I think that exactly speaks to your point, Prisca. All of you sort of have realized that you have to sort of understand these transborder movements if you're going to dismantle social justice. Has to happen in your community, but it also has to happen across borders. And I think that's something apparent in all of your work. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was a fantastic conversation. We have Dr. Enrique Perez and Dr. Prisca Gayles and Dr. Satsuki Ina, and who knows, maybe eventually Dr. Escenthio Marigny. And I'm Meredith Oda. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you. This is the Core Humanities Thoughts on Tap series. Please join us next month for our panel on building legacies of economic empowerment. And there will be a survey once you close this window. So I would encourage you to take it so we can hear your feedback.
Yeah. Thank you to everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Escenthio.
Thank you so much, everyone. So
Thank you all.
Meredith. Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
all.